Welcome to today's Explainer. Okay, we are taking on an absolutely massive, and I mean massive journey today. We're going to compress an awe-inspiring 60,000 years of the Indian subcontinent's history into a clear, dynamic story of continuous rebirth. Now, I know what you're thinking. When you hear 60,000 years, it's super easy to worry about getting bogged down by endless dates, confusing names, and just a tangled web of events. But don't worry. We are going to focus purely on the big picture, the massive shifts and the undeniable themes that shaped this ancient civilization. As you'll see, it's a story of a region continuously reinventing itself century after century.
Okay, let's dive into this. To make this huge timeline actually digestible, we've broken it down into 5 key eras to give you a really clear historical roadmap. We're going to start with the early foundations, move into the classical empires, explore the medieval synthesis, examine the colonial disruption, and finally, look at the modern rebirth.
All right, let's start at the very beginning with epoch number 1, early foundations. This takes us all the way from prehistoric cave dwellers to the foundational texts of classical Hinduism. Let's set the scene. Picture this. For literally tens of thousands of years, early humans lived out their lives as hunter-gatherers in rock shelters like Bhimbetka. But as the climate warmed up, agriculture took root, and that led to a brilliant leap forward. By 2500 BCE, the Indus Valley Civilization was suddenly rivaling Egypt and Mesopotamia. It was incredible. But, nothing lasts forever. As those major cities started to decline, Indo-Aryan groups arrived around 1500 BCE, and that kicked off the early Vedic Age. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer contrast between these two foundational eras. It's like shifting gears completely. On one side, you have the Indus Valley Civilization. We are talking about a highly urbanized society. Cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro had grid-patterned streets, baked brick houses, public baths, and drainage systems that showed just unbelievable civic planning for the time. But then, as environmental changes and shifting rivers likely forced those cities into decline, we transitioned to the Vedic Age. Indo-Aryan groups moved in, bringing early Sanskrit with them. And unlike the urban Indus builders, this early Vedic society was mostly pastoral. They were organized into tribes and clans, and actually it was during this much more rural, pastoral time that the Rig Veda was composed, which laid the religious and social foundations for classical Hinduism. And that brings us to our second epoch, classical empires. We're spanning from the Mahajanapadas to the Guptas here. This is a time marked by massive ideological shifts, expanding agriculture, and the rise of the subcontinent's very first great united empires. So as agriculture and trade really started to expand in the later Vedic Age, those old tribal clans evolved. By the 6th century BCE, we see the rise of the Mahajanapadas. Basically, these were 16 major states, powerful ones like Magadha, Kosala, and Vatsa. And they sparked what historians call India's second urbanization, bringing in new towns and coinage. But with all this new wealth came a serious challenge to the old ways. This whole wave of intellectual ferment directly led to the birth of major new religions. It was during this exact time that Mahavira spread the teachings of Jainism and Gautama Buddha founded Buddhism. Both of them were really pushing back against those older, rigid, ritualistic practices. Eventually, all those competing states gave way to a much larger vision. Chandragupta Maurya stepped up and established the Mauryan Empire, uniting a huge chunk of northern India under a really strong, centralized bureaucracy. Decades later, his grandson Ashoka fought the devastating Kalinga War. Now, after the Mauryan Empire eventually weakened, regional kingdoms popped back up for a few centuries until Chandragupta I kicked off the Gupta era in 320 CE, unifying the north all over again.
But actually, let's just pause on Emperor Ashoka for a second, because his story is absolutely remarkable, and this brilliantly illustrates a profound ideological pivot. Ashoka conquered Kalinga, right? But the war caused an incredibly heavy loss of life. Horrified by that brutal slaughter, Ashoka fundamentally changed his entire approach to power. He adopted Buddhism and started promoting Dhamma, which means righteous conduct and nonviolence. So instead of building monuments to his conquests, he spread his message of peace through these massive rock and pillar edicts all across his empire. It is just a striking narrative juxtaposition. You have the creator of one of India's largest and most deadly military conquests transforming into history's most famous royal advocate for nonviolence. No way you'd expect that, right?
So following those Mauryan years and various regional shifts, we hit the Gupta era, and this is often called a golden age. Under rulers like Samudragupta and Chandragupta II,
classical arts, astronomy, and science completely peaked. Sanskrit literature and mathematics flourished, and great learning centers like the famous Nalanda really prospered. But hey, it wasn't just happening in the north. Down south, the early Tamil kingdoms, the Chola, Chera, and Pandya were rapidly developing and dominating massive maritime trade routes. Even after the Guptas declined, the cultural growth didn't stop. By the 7th century, you had Harshavardhana ruling the north, while down south, dynasties like the Pallavas and Chalukyas were building these world-famous temples and championing literature. All of this sets the stage for our third epic, the medieval synthesis. This is the era of the Sultanates and the Mughals. It's a period defined by fierce regional conflicts and the pivotal arrival of new Islamic cultures. While the northern kingdoms were busy fighting each other over trade routes, new forces started arriving from the west. We go from early raids and footholds in Sindh to the decisive battles of the 12th century, where Muhammad Ghori's victories eventually led to the establishment of the Delhi Sultanate in 1206. At the exact same time, powerful southern empires like Vijayanagara fiercely resisted this northern expansion, building incredibly rich cultures of their own. This dynamic held until a whole new chapter began in 1526 with the arrival of the Mughals. So, the crucial point is how the Mughals created a deeply composite Indo-Islamic culture. They became one of the most influential dynasties in Indian history. Babur kicked it all off by defeating the Lodi dynasty at Panipat. But look at Akbar. He was a real game changer. He expanded the empire, brought in a highly flexible revenue system, and famously promoted open religious discussions at his court, smartly integrating regional elites. Then you have Shah Jahan, who pushed the artistic tradition to its absolute peak. He built the Taj Mahal. Finally, Aurangzeb pushed the empire to its absolute vastest territorial limits, but his endless wars severely strained resources. After his death, central authority crumbled, leaving a massive power vacuum in the 18th century that allowed regional forces like the Marathas and Sikhs to rise up. And that power vacuum? It leads right into our fourth epic, colonial disruption, taking us from trade to empire. This marks a dark geopolitical disruption where the subcontinent's incredible wealth attracted foreign powers who basically dismantled local authority. Let's move to and see how this builds, because this absolutely wasn't an overnight conquest. It was an aggressive, multi-step progression. Step 1, they arrive as traders. Vasco da Gama reached Calicut in 1498, and the British East India Company got its charter in 1600, setting up trading posts. Step 2, they become territorial rulers. The huge turning point here is 1757 at the Battle of Plassey. The company won, started ruling directly, and systematically reshaped India's revenue and legal systems entirely to suit British interests. And finally, step 3, direct crown rule. By 1858, the British government stepped in, dissolved the company, and took over the whole shebang directly. Now, you might be wondering, what exactly forced the British government to step in directly in 1858? Well, it was the explosive events of the year prior. Growing anger against the East India Company's exploitative policies finally boiled over into the revolts of 1857. Soldiers and local rulers violently clashed with the British. And while the British did repress the revolt and take direct control, this moment was the definitive spark of a modern political awakening. It spurred social reform movements, heavily criticized social evils, and laid the groundwork for nationalism, which eventually led to the founding of the Indian National Congress in 1885. Which brings us to our final, highly energetic epoch, the modern rebirth. This is all about the transition from colonial subjects to a modern independent republic, driven entirely by mass movements. Going into the early 20th century, the national movement shifted gears fast. Moderate petitions turned into radical boycotts, especially after the 1905 partition of Bengal. The anger only deepened in 1919 after the horrific Jallianwala Bagh massacre. That's when Gandhi launched the non-cooperation movement, making non-violent struggle the absolute core of Indian nationalism. By 1930, he was leading the Dandi Salt March, kicking off massive civil disobedience. And by 1942, the Quit India movement was demanding immediate British withdrawal. All of this relentless pressure finally culminated on August 15, 1947, when India gained independence, though tragically it was accompanied by the partition of the subcontinent and devastating violence. From that hard-won independence, they had to build a modern state, and fast. In 1950, the Constitution established India as a sovereign democratic republic. But the new nation immediately faced tough challenges. Regional wars in the 60s and 70s deeply shaped its foreign policy. To cement its strategic independence, India conducted its first nuclear test in 1974.
Then, a massive pivot happened in 1991. Major economic reforms liberalized trade and industry, vastly accelerating growth. And that right there propelled India into the 21st century as a total powerhouse of information technology, space missions, and ongoing rural development.
So what does this all mean? When you stand back and look at the whole picture, from the stone tools of Bhimbetka to the grid streets of Harappa, from Ashoka's edicts of peace to the incredible artistic heights of the Mughals, from the struggles against colonial disruption to the launch pads of modern space missions, this region has experienced a continuous, mind-blowing cycle of reinvention. Having survived 60,000 years of empires, invasions, and just remarkable rebirths, we're left with a fascinating question. As an economic and technological heavyweight today, how will this ancient civilization shape our global future? Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey through history. I really hope you leave today with a much deeper understanding of this spectacular story.